guest to Mistra's discussion policy on just transition climate finance in South Africa. I am Nqobile Xaba and I will be your program director today. Just a bit of house rules. Please ensure that your mic is muted at all times and you can unmute when asked to speak. Please post all your questions on the chat function and these will be attended to during the discussion session. The Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection, MISTRA, recently launched a research publication on the just transition to a low carbon economy in South Africa. This publication develops core aspects of the just transition debate as it unfolds in South Africa and offers concrete policy proposals for facilitating a just transition. This publication features high-level experts in relevant fields, and they argue that a low-carbon transition that does not address South Africa's socio-economic challenges will not succeed. And two of the main questions posed were, how can South Africa decarbonize while providing economic opportunities for the most vulnerable and alleviating inequality? And more importantly, what role can key stakeholders play to ensure a just transition to a low carbon economy in South Africa? There has been a lot of interest in just transition finance in South Africa since the announcement of the pledges in a deal announced at COP26 to help with emissions reduction. This is an issue that affects all stakeholders, including the energy sector, financial institutions, and the broader civil society. Therefore, there is a need to ensure that the relevant stakeholders are engaged in the early stages of the discourse on financing mechanisms to support South Africa's just transition pathway. It is in this context that MISTRA is holding this discussion with the head of the Presidential Climate Finance Task Team, Mr. Daniel Minele, as our keynote speaker today. Firstly, I would like to invite my co-editor, Salim Fekia, the co-editor of MISTRA's publication and the executive director of the African Climate Foundation, to tell us a bit more about the work that we did on this publication and in relation to today's discussion. Over to you, Salim.
Thank you, Nqobile, and also it's just a pleasure to be here and also have the presence of Daniel and Chantal, who will talk about the Just Energy Transition Partnership initiative just now. I don't want to be long because I want to thank MISTRA for hosting this meeting on the back of launch of a book that was in the making of the last year. And really the essence of the book was to capture the diverse thinking in the country on the just transition. Part of that work was done by the National Planning Commission a couple of years back. And we thought that it would be useful to just get the latest update and pull together a couple of authors, some of whom are actually present on this call. But I do think that the just transition issue has become a flagship issue in South Africa and is gaining a lot of interest, particularly after South Africa secured a pledge. And I want to remind people that it is a pledge of 8.5 billion, the details of which will be hopefully shared with the audience in a few minutes. We still have to develop an investment plan, and many other aspects of the Just Energy Transition Partnership has to be resolved. But the book really tries to capture diverse views from labor union, the scientific community, people who are involved in looking at skills development, the economic aspects of the just transition. There are also chapters on finance, which has been largely written by Chantal, and I'm sure she will talk about that. And it is an area she's currently involved in. And also geopolitical aspects. I do think that the issue around the just transition, we were planning to have this as a session also with people who are directly involved in the coal mining industry, not only the coal mining companies, but workers and people who are involved in the supply chain. Unfortunately, because of the conflict with the mining Indaba, we were not able to get the right people on board. So we've opened up this session to a wider audience, and we hope to have a special session with them in the coming weeks. So I would just encourage people to read the book, which for me reflects positions that have been written by people that are not just academic, but people who are actually practitioners, both young, new people who have shown a growing interest in this area, and also people who are regarded as stalwarts in the field of climate and so on. But lastly, I would just say that the just transition debate brings us closer to what has once been a very strong emphasis on what I would say normative and environmental concerns, to what I would now argue are becoming more economy-wide issues, and in which the hard trade-offs have to be considered. And it's a battle between idealism and pragmatism and realism that will unfold in the next couple of years. And I'm sure Daniel will talk to some of these issues. So from my side, it's a real pleasure just to make a few opening remarks, encourage you to read and critically challenge the positions in the book, and also participate in the evolving just transition work that is happening in the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salim, for those remarks. I would like now to introduce Chantal Naidu, who is one of our authors in this publication, and she will chair the next session and will introduce our keynote speaker. Over to you, Chantal.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all can hear me clearly. And thank you to Mistra for organizing this event and for these opening remarks as well. It was, first of all, a great pleasure to contribute to the book, and at the same time, from a financing perspective, it was quite a challenge to write about something that was unfolding live as we were as authors. And perhaps just a few things before I introduce Daniel is that the JETP is a real wonderful opportunity from my perspective, because it lands on very fertile and thoughtful work that's been happening, amongst a number of parties in government and outside of government the last 2 to 3 years, which was evidenced by a lot of ideas, creativity, thoughts, different views, lots of seemingly fragmented views. Well, what I've learned about the finance space on this is that as much as it's been challenging and as much as there's been different ideas, it is clear that financing a transition process is different. It's different in the sense that there is intended disruption, there's intended uncertainty, but there's also the inevitability of a set of investments that have to happen towards a particular direction. And that direction being away from fossil fuel dependency and a shift towards cleaner dimensions. And the challenge for finance is, how do you do this in the messy middle? There's a role for finance in that messy middle. And the JETP is the first actual practical example globally to bring together and manifest the forces of international, national, public, private, in trying to contribute and answer that question of how do we do this in the messy middle. So Salim challenged and reminded us that pragmatism, realism, idealism is a confluence of energies that we are dealing with. And I have great pleasure now to introduce Daniel Mminele, who is well known in the spaces. Of course, we know he's a former deputy governor at the Reserve Bank and ex-CEO of ABSA. And I think the country is very lucky to have him to lead the Presidential Climate Finance Task Force. So we look forward to hearing his interventions. And if I may hand over to Daniel to present. Thank you.
Thank you, Chantal. I hope everybody can hear me well. And thanks, Nobila and Salim as well for your introductory comments. I would also just like to start by thanking Mistra for the kind invitation to deliver the keynote address at today's policy discussion, and really for creating this platform and convening us as key stakeholders and role players to exchange views, to share ideas on how we should think about and, more importantly, act as we confront this very strategic challenge of just transition and how to finance it. And let me also just add and take this opportunity to congratulate and commend the editors and the broader Mistra team on their leadership in conceiving and compiling this recent publication that was just referred to on just transition. And I guess given the many views on just transition that are out there, thoughtful and considered policy research is essential to draw together the fragments, if you wish, into a coherent narrative. And of course, the research is imperative to underpin more coherent and pragmatic actions as the transition unfolds. When you start discussing these complex and intertwined topics of climate change, climate finance, just transition, just energy transition, transition finance, you struggle to do justice to the task on hand in the allocated time, and it is quite easy to get lost in the forest. So in my remarks today, I will restrict myself to touching on the nature of the Just Energy Transition Partnership between South Africa and our international partners, talk about the structure and the process we've put in place to pursue this partnership. Then focus on South Africa's approach, provide an update in terms of where matters currently stand and what the next steps would be, before offering some final thoughts as I conclude. Most of you will be familiar with the political declaration that was issued at COP26 in November last year, wherein the governments of South Africa, France, Germany, the United Kingdom and the United States, and also the European Union established this partnership to support South Africa's transition to a low-carbon economy and a climate-resilient society. In terms of that political declaration, partner countries pledged to mobilize an initial amount of $8.5 billion to support South Africa's transition through a combination of financial instruments, including grants, concession loans, over a period of 3 to 5 years. And since the announcement of this partnership, the international interest in it has been increasing, with many countries keenly watching and hoping that South Africa will set a precedent for how to engage international climate resources to support a just transition. A distinguishing feature, or one of the distinguishing features of the partnership, cited by many, is the emphasis that it places on how justice is achieved for affected workers and communities that presently depend highly on the fossil fuel industry for their livelihoods. The political declaration really aims to capture the motivation and direction of South Africa's response to climate change and its action in that regard. In particular, the partnership proposes that the funding be used for the accelerated decarbonization of South Africa's electricity system and for the development of new low-carbon sectors such as green hydrogen and electric vehicles, and to ensure that a just transition for affected workers and communities, ensure that in the context of South Africa's growth and development priorities. And the energy and transport sectors currently hold the highest potential for emission reductions for South Africa, and it's no coincidence that the focus is on them. The single biggest contributor to South Africa's carbon emissions, many of you will be aware, is electricity production, just over 40% of emissions. And reducing emissions in this sector is one of the focus areas of the partnership, which, however, must also position South Africa to take advantage of opportunities in green technology, in particular, as I've just indicated, from new energy vehicles and the production of green hydrogen for local use as well as export. And the development of these industries will require substantial public and private sector investments to achieve their potential, and of course the resultant job creation and economic growth opportunities. It's important to mention that this is only an initial amount that we're talking about, and as a country, we recognize that the transition costs for South Africa are quite immense and will need more partners, not only those that signed up to the political declaration. And this actually is already happening, as we have been approached by other governments showing interest, which is evidence that the partnership holds catalytic potential to mobilize critical future funding. The scale of investment required for South Africa to achieve the ambitious targets that were outlined in the updated nationally determined contribution that was submitted to the COP conference in Glasgow far exceed the 8.5 billion, and a broad range of partners is necessary to support and mobilize additional funding. Just to give an example, if one looks at green hydrogen alone, it is estimated that South Africa requires initial seed capital of around $1 billion to expedite green hydrogen to allow us to export about 20 kilotons per year, and to scale that production up to around 270 kilotons per year, a further $13 billion would be required. And I was actually quite fortunate just last Friday to be able to attend the launch of a proof of concept of a green hydrogen powered zero emission sort of mine haul truck. This is a truck that moves about 300 tons, and prior to conversion to green hydrogen was consuming about 3,000 liters of diesel a day. So you can see the potential of the change that these new technologies can bring. And as regards electric vehicles, again, we know that South Africa over many decades has been an integral part of the International Division of Labour and the motor industry, and that the country serves as a hub for exports of certain vehicle models, and with that contributing to about 15% of our export revenues and directly employing over 100 people, and of course a lot more if one starts thinking about the backward and forward linkages of that industry. Let me now briefly share with you the structure and the process around the partnership that we've put in place to deliver on the JETP commitments. The APEC structure for interacting and negotiating with our international partner is the Presidential Climate Finance Task Team, which was established in early February this year. And the task team reports to an interministerial committee that is chaired by the president himself. And my task as the head of the task team essentially is to bring to cabinet via the interministerial committee final recommendations on an investment plan and a financing package negotiated with international partners, which primarily will demonstrate the centrality of just transitions through a managed transition and an investment process. This, of course, is a daunting task, as many of you will imagine. And while it is targeted at the initial $8.5 billion to turn that into tangible flows, it needs to be executed within the context of a broad systemic lens as opposed to a climate finance lens only. So multiple, complex, urgent, and challenging issues are at play here, which affect South Africa's development and growth trajectory. As a nation, we tragically already face increased evidence of climate vulnerability. The recent floods in KZN and parts of the Eastern Cape being a case in point, and of course the associated losses and response strategies, and the existing high levels of inequality and poverty, continued energy and water security threats, and the looming carbon border tax adjustments of our trading partners in the global north. I must say I'm very grateful for the support of stakeholders across government in working on this important task. The assets and liability management team from the National Treasury, particularly, are playing a critical role to analyze the financial implications on the fiscus of any financing package, which obviously relates to its composition, its affordability, and how it is aligned with our regulatory environment and an impact on the national borrowing program and budgets. So the structure of the partnership comprises a three-tier structure consisting of the South African Presidential Climate Finance Task Team and its counterpart, which we refer to as the IPG, which stands for International Partners Group. We are supported at the next level by an independent secretariat, which facilitates technical and related engagements and also coordinates at the third level a number of technical working groups that reflect the areas of priorities that we agreed upon. The Presidential Climate Finance Task Team is made up of a diverse, multidisciplinary team of individuals with the relevant expertise and experience, and I'm privileged to work with individuals that were responsible for fostering this partnership at COP26 and securing these commitments and this development and climate-related resources for South Africa, and with others that will strengthen the ability to co-design large public-private sector investment programs through a just transition lens. We are in the process of forming 3 sector-focused working groups and 2 cross-cutting working groups focusing on finance and implementation. And we made a strategic decision that each of these groups will have to conduct their work through a just transition lens, which allows us to embed and not see it separate, the imperative of putting a just transition at the center of investment plans and the financing package. The Secretariat is funded by the Climate Investment Funds on an arm's length basis. And we were happy and lucky to secure Ms. Joanne Yawich to act as the chair of the Secretariat, and she is obviously well known to many of you from the National Business Initiative. We look forward to drawing on inputs, on insights, and support from a broad range of domestic stakeholders to ensure as inclusive a process as possible. And in this regard, I would just highlight the extensive work on which the partnership will be able to draw specific to just transition. And just to name a few, the initial just transition work that is ongoing at the National Development and at the National Planning Commission, including the just framework that they were consulting on during a conference last week, which some of you may have attended, COSATU's Just Transition Blueprint, the civil society's Just Transition Open Agenda, and the many contributions by business, academia, and policy think tanks, including MISTRA. So we don't aim to start from scratch. Our aim is to build on what has been done and consider contributions that will be available for the task before us. And I'm hopeful that we might, what might appear at the moment to be quite fragmented propositions can soon be consolidated and any areas of additional insights be identified and addressed. So we will also draw on the work that members of the IPG themselves already done, and also the multinational development and financial institutions. So if I may then just turn to sort of South Africa's approach to the just transition. And I believe several key messages would be important to highlight at this stage as they relate to South Africa's approach. First, recognition of the importance of addressing climate change. I think South Africa has submitted an ambitious and nationally determined contribution that I referred to earlier, just before COP26, which commits South Africa to a target range, which I guess many of you are aware of between 420 million tons of CO2 equivalent to 350. And the intention of the partnership is to help us achieve this target, which is also in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement and compatible with a global temperature increase not exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius. It won't be easy to achieve this, and it will require substantial new investment to enable our transition to a low-carbon economy. It will also require a substantial and managed divestment or shifts in high-carbon industries, those that emit high carbons, as transition implies somewhat of a two-way shift. The other issue is translation from declarations into practical issues. So the IPG and the related development finance institutions have expressed a strong commitment to support South Africa's ambition to transition to a low-carbon economy and a more climate resilient society, as I've mentioned earlier. And it's essential that such a commitment translate into tangible financial support on terms and conditions that positively contribute towards South Africa's objectives and don't create unintended consequences that may negatively impact future generations of South Africans. And thirdly, building resilience. So the partnership should support South Africa's economic growth and job creation efforts alongside reduced carbon emissions to ensure that workers and communities benefit appropriately from our shift to a greener future. And in this regard, South Africa must ensure that country-specific circumstances are fully considered so that we can demonstrate ownership and leadership in this process. Fourth, setting the pace of the transition. It is essential to emphasize that the pace and the extent of decarbonization in South Africa will have to be determined by the extent of available resources. So the partnership should offer long-term cooperation commensurate with the timeline for South Africa's just energy transition. We must also look at pragmatic short-term action. So South Africa's investment plan will therefore include a short-term program to identify and secure funding for critical, urgent projects that can be initiated before COP27, and of course a longer-term program, both of which will contain essential features that enable the just transition. Another important feature of our approach is to ensure that there is growth in fixed capital formation. That's quite essential. That for South Africa to achieve its social and economic aspirations, we need to make sure that we invest in green technologies through the partnerships, that we provide an opportunity to grow fixed capital towards the 30% of GDP target, which is included in the National Development Plan, which would require us to move from a current level of about 15% of GDP. Another important issue would be how we sequence investments. So the investment plan should significantly contribute towards strengthening our future energy security and not jeopardize this imperative. And by decommissioning coal-fired power stations through a managed process and rapidly expanding alternative sources of power, South Africa can achieve greater security of supply. We can reduce the risk of load shedding and accelerate economic growth and job creation. And the partnership needs also to manifest and enable investment in the energy sector in the short term to contribute towards this imperative. And in addition, investments in green hydrogen and electric vehicles are essential complementary investment necessary for the medium to long term. And the plan should include components of these that can be addressed in parallel to the energy investments. And I guess a critical point to state, it's obvious but worth repeating, is that this is all our partnership. It's not governments. So the government must work with the private sector to facilitate its contribution to the partnership and the country's transition efforts more broadly, with a view to effectively using the international financial support and mobilizing domestic resources to complement such support. And that obviously speaks to inclusive engagement, which requires that South Africa undertakes extensive engagement with social partners, including through the Presidential Climate Commission, building on the work of the National Planning Commission, to ensure that its transition plans reflect the needs of affected constituencies and ultimately achieved a just and inclusive impact. And as I indicated earlier, some of this work, some of you may have followed last week and participated in the PCC conference as part of this process. So these principles that I've just stated in terms of what South Africa's approach should be and will be, should then manifest in a financing package and investment plans through the partnership that address South Africa's fiscal realities and priorities and upholds development and climate finance principles that are applicable to developing countries generally. So in practice, this means that the developed countries are obliged to support mitigation and adaptation measures in developing countries, which needs to be evidenced by both the quantity in terms of the amount of flows and the quality, which needs to speak to access, design, and implementation modalities of the financing package. So financing instruments should reflect South Africa's unique needs and fiscal challenges and incorporate appropriate and equitable risk-sharing arrangements. These include, for example, risk mitigation instruments, grants, concessional loans, and other appropriate tools, be they financial or otherwise, that contribute towards the cost of the country's transition, but without inhibiting or negatively impacting the country's national borrowing programs and budgets. And of course, any debt-related terms should be more attractive than the country could secure in the capital markets without unduly onerous reporting requirements. And the level of constitutionality of any debt-related instruments must reflect both the obligation of developed countries to finance mitigation and adaptation measures in developing countries and the significant cost of these measures. So in that, then finance flows from the partner countries through the partnership need to be predictable and certain, and they need to enable the sustained momentum of South Africa's investment plan necessary to achieve its target of net zero carbon emission by 2050. Very briefly, where do things stand now and what are the next steps? So we are in intensive discussions with the IPG as we speak, with a view to better understanding the necessary detail regarding the funding elements to be provided through the partnership, and are also intensifying work on South Africa's investment plan, with a special emphasis how such a plan enables the just transition. We have also been meeting with colleagues across governments, including the PCC, as I've mentioned, to develop an aligned and coherent South African approach with engagements with the private sector, with civil society organizations to follow. And of course, today's interaction forms part of this ongoing process of consultation. And as the President has said repeatedly, we need to bring all parties along as best as possible and not leave people behind. I guess the one thing to stress to you is that the JETP is not a bilateral process. As indicated earlier, while it is led by government, by the South African government, it is of course done on behalf of the people of South Africa, and the IPG, similarly, it's not an exclusive club. We need the support of more partners, whether under the umbrella of the IPG or independently. It is also not a short-term process. Yes, we need to demonstrate tangible progress and identify specific investment and associated funding in the coming months, so that by the time we get to COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, we can show some tangible progress. But this is just the foundation for a longer-term process. Our decarbonization journey is a 30-year plus undertaking, and we must ensure that the decisions we take today support our efforts tomorrow. And it is also not exclusively a public sector process. We have always been clear that the 8.5 billion is only a start and is insufficient to fund our transition. It is drawn from public sector finances, but these are dwarfed by what is available in the private capital markets, and we need to develop mechanisms to mobilize these forms of finance to invest in South Africa's transition, which means that we need to deploy this initial amount such that we can crowd in and access the much bigger pools of funding that are out there. The one thing that I guess we would also need to accept is that it will not be business as usual, in that the distinguishing feature of the partnership is putting the impact on affected livelihoods at the center of considering the investment plan and financing package. While South African financial institutions in particular can draw from lessons from their vast experience in financing other economic transitions to support this transition, which is informed by an environmental imperative, we need to appreciate that this is a different paradigm, which may require a different approach to issues such as risk allocation, return expectation, and investment horizon. There's a need to invest in understanding what is different and how to innovate to ensure that financial products and services serve the goals of justice and an inclusive and equitable manner in the real economy. And of course, the financial community is heavily engaging since the Paris Agreement around their contributions to making finance flows consistent with the Paris Agreement. And in the UNFCCC's 2020 biennial assessment, over 115 new initiatives are noted globally involving new products and services, regulatory and legal standards, and voluntary pacts to achieve net zero outcomes. Some of these initiatives speak to blending finance, which means using public, private, and philanthropy resources. But in many respects, the actual practices are still catching up, and the quantity of finance alone will not enable a just transition. And of course, it is also the quality of how investment programs are constructed, the impact of the real economy of new financial products and services, and consistency with which investment portfolios are constructed or reconstructed. I also believe that it is accepting that financing and supporting just transition is the responsibility of all finance flows, public and private, international and national. So while the significant commitments made by the IPG and the multilateral institutions to South Africa will aid in our journey, it is essential that private sector capital follow suit and contribute to these objectives. This will require financial institutions to demonstrate the flexibility, innovation, and creativity that is necessary to appropriately balance risk and return with a view to supporting our country's development, and not just over the next financial year, but for decades to come. So the financial sector, of course, is a very powerful force in advancing South Africa's just transition. And if we work in a complementary manner, we strengthen the entire financial system, making it compatible with the country's climate response and focus on a just transition. The challenge is how to sequence investments that reduce the impact of the inevitable trajectory of climate finance while we have the chance to prepare before certain actions may be imposed on South Africa, either through climate events, as we have started to see, or global economic shifts. So I commend the South African financial community for their awareness of climate risks and the initial steps that they've taken to promote the country's climate response. And the work that is already underway in the financial sector, and of course not only in the financial sector, with regard to embedding ESG and sustainability principles into business models and strategies, and the efforts that have been ongoing into disclosure and reporting changes all hold a promise. And primary examples of this are the National Treasury's Green Finance Taxonomy, which help in this regard to guide the financial sector and the economy overall, and the GSE's sustainability-focused listing and disclosure guidance to guide the issuers on that exchange. Let me draw to a close and offer some final thoughts. Socrates is credited with saying that, and I quote, "Understanding your question is half your answer," end of quote. And of course, with the task that I've taken on, we have many more questions than answers to offer at these meetings. I know this because of all the questions that we have been receiving, including no doubt some that will follow this talk. And I assure you that we're working hard to understand these questions and develop appropriate responses, which of course we will develop together with you. The barrage of questions personally do not dishearten me, because unless we ask ourselves deeply what questions we should be asking to deliver a just and inclusive transition for South Africa, our responses are at risk of being narrow, pedestrian, and thus not impactful. And at the same time, expedient responses will also mean that we may lock in path dependencies that themselves become issues of future generations to unravel. So if I may then close by extending an invitation to the private sector, civil society, financial sector, and more specifically, to appreciate and welcome the immense interest in the JETP, but also again, to remember that this is not a one-way conversation. We need you all to ask questions and develop responses about your own participation in and to support South Africa's just transition. Together, we rely on your answers to find the way forward, and the JETP is not the magical pot at the end of a rainbow. At best, it is an initial contribution to our national efforts, and we need to take steps, and we need creativity and impetus of South African grown solutions to take us further. So I will leave it at that. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. I think in the chat there is something well articulated by Joel to say this is a very comprehensive and lucid presentation and very clear in terms of the different issues you're grappling with and also the progress and the positive energy that stands behind it. There are some questions in the chat, and if I can ask Pelisa Nkomo to maybe open her mic and maybe share it. It relates to Eskom and its contribution in terms of the just transition.
Hi, thank you so much, Chantel, and good morning. Thank you so much, Mr. Minelli, for such a comprehensive presentation. I truly appreciate. So one of my question really is that the discourse that we seem to have taken in as far as just transition, for me, is a bit confusing, and I'll tell you why. I think the first issue is that if you look at the several rounds of the renewable energy, Eskom seemed to be the buyer, right? With very much minimal involvement. And I'm interested to hear, and when I talk about the minimal involvement in as far as, for example, the shareholding one, because Eskom is a big utility, and the implications about, the signals, in fact, about the approach in how it's been excluded in the renewable round, is that it's possible that the long-term plan is to close down Eskom. I think the second issue is that Eskom, with its massive capacity in terms of both in terms of industrial capacity and as well as technological capacity, is that it's being just overlooked and bringing in renewable energy just above Eskom. And obviously the third implication for me, obviously, is job losses and technical capacity associated with workers who would have such expertise. And so I really want to understand, I think based on this picture that I've just painted, I want to understand what is the thinking, within your team around what would be the just, and I think, thank you for an open invitation for civil society to participate, because I chair the board of Oxfam in South Africa, and we're quite big on the climate change, and I would really like to have a follow-up conversation with you around this. But I think what the question I'd ask is, what is really, what are you thinking as the team on how to include Eskom? Because I do think that Eskom remains such an important resource that should not be overlooked in the just transition period, including as well communities whose livelihoods are linked to Eskom. And I think this is not from an energy perspective only, but also small, medium enterprises, and as well as other multiplier effects. Thank you.
Daniel, would you like to answer a few, collect a few, or would you like to answer?
Yeah, let's maybe take them in batches of 3 or 4, Chantel, if that's okay.
Okay, we have one from Joel and one from Sheila in that order, which is specific to the funding. If I can ask Joel first and then Sheila to share their questions.
Thank you, Chantal, and good afternoon to all the colleagues. The presentation was very comprehensive and very lucid, and it clarifies South Africa's approach to just transition finance. The question here is whether the prospective international funders and lenders agree with us on this broad approach, and whether they accept our lead in identifying the kind of interventions that are required in South Africa. For instance, what the money should be used for, the sequencing, time frames, and so on and so forth. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Chantal, you said there was another question?
Yes, Ms. Sheila Sisulu, if I can open her mic, please, so she can share. If that's not possible, I can also read out her question.
Can you hear me?
Thanks, Sheila. Yes, we hear you.
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. My question is not too dissimilar to Joel's question. It relates to strings attached or conditionalities for this funding. For example, will South Africa be expected to use, purchase, source technology and related products from the funding countries? We know this happens, and so I'd like to know how much of this funding is, one, without strings, and two, that it will follow what South Africa wants to do. As I say, it's similar to what Joel was asking. Sorry, Chantal, while I have the floor, I may have missed the point about how individuals, how are citizens going to be assisted to protect themselves for the impact, from the impacts of climate change. Education is one thing, but practically, what should we do as individual citizens, concerned citizens, even if we're organized, to engage in climate mitigation? Thanks.
Sheila, would you quickly mind, just for Daniel and the audience benefit, just saying similar to Felisa as chair of Oxfam SA, just your association, just so we can get a sense of that?
Oh, I'm the Chancellor of Walter Sisulu University.
Great. Should we tackle those for now, Chantal?
Sure, Daniel, thank you.
Thank you very much for those questions. And I think the very first one would need to be answered quite emphatically to state that there is no way in which Eskom could be overlooked in this process. They are integral to the just energy transition in South Africa, and it is no coincidence that in terms of the three priority areas that were identified in the political declaration, if you wish, the priority is actually around energy transition and the electricity sector. So Eskom is very much part and parcel of the solution to how we decarbonize, and of course, given the cross-cutting nature of the energy situation, and which is already challenging as we speak today, that is a priority area. There is no way in which we could hope to succeed if we didn't place emphasis of ensuring that Eskom is an integral part of this process, and we're obviously working very closely with them in that regard. So the other questions that are around sort of policy directions in the future of Eskom and what the plans are there, and whether somebody might be preparing to close down Eskom or not, that is a little bit outside my province in terms of what I've been asked to do here. So I wouldn't want to venture any opinions and comments in that regard, but I can certainly confirm that Eskom is an integral part of this just transition solution. And they've been doing quite good work. and they, as you know, have themselves dedicated resources to a just energy transition office that they've set up there, where some good work is being done, and we'll be working very closely with them and with the partners to see how, as part of this partnership, we can help solve some of the very difficult problems at Eskom. Joel, a very important question to ask around the meeting of minds there. And I think if one looks at the political declaration that South Africa and all the partners have signed up to, it very clearly spells out South Africa's ambitions and South Africa's priorities. And there's a clear understanding that this process needs to be country-owned, it needs to be country-led, it needs to be country-specific and speak to our own needs. So when it comes to the timing and the sequencing of implementing the program, certainly my impression to date is that our partners are sufficiently appreciative and sensitive to this program needing to be fit for purpose and take into account South African priorities, and that needs to inform our overall approach to what our growth and development model is going to be going forward. And I think people also appreciate that this is quite a complex task. And as you know, what we're dealing with here is a systemic kind of change. And you can see how easily it straddles a whole host of policy areas. And we're obviously talking about environmental policy first and foremost, but we're going very quickly then into trade policy. We go quickly into into industrial policy, social policies. You can get into employment policies, and of course fiscal, as we've said. So this is a big, broader economic transformation issue that has to have these just components given proper attention. So at this stage, we obviously still need to get into more the technicalities around negotiations, and that sort of then straddles into the third question from Sheila around, conditionalities and strings attached, and whether there's requirement to then want to purchase technologies from these partner countries. Those are issues that we are, in terms of negotiation, still early in the process of, but the overarching principle of saying that this partnership needs to speak to South African ambitions and priorities is one that I think there's no disagreement on. Paul, and then there was a final question around, I guess, practically what we should be doing. And I guess first and foremost, and which I see it happening more and more, is just to make sure that we are informed, that we really understand what the vagaries, what the risks around climate finance are. And I think most of you know that the more you unpeel that onion, the more scary it gets. And but it needs to be then informed very practical action in our own individual lives, and whatever small little contribution that we can all make will be important to make sure that we manage these risks appropriately.
Thank you, Daniel. The next set of questions we have is from Mandisa, then Emily and Lamise. If I can ask them to open their mics. Mandisa's one is particularly interesting for me because you've just spoken about this slew of different policies that the Just Transition opens up. So Mandisa, could you go first?
Thank you. My name is Mandisa. I'm interested to know, probably my first comment is linked to Sheila, the interest rate, if we know how much we're going to pay for this going forward. But my main question is around urban planning. If you see in the chat group, I said I visited Cape Town in December after a while because of lockdown. And as I was driving around, I was stunned by the growth of informal settlements. And I started thinking that it's obvious that people are invading land. And when we talk about the availability of green energy, do we have a clear urban plan? Have we costed it? And I know this is not the issue of the task team, it's the issue of the state. But the state has to take into consideration that people that is providing social housing to have to benefit from this. Where's the plan? A broad-based plan that will take into consideration the costs going forward, so that we are not caught napping and say, no, we didn't know. We're just focusing on the loan that has been given and therefore is going to benefit the country. We're going to have low carbon economy and everything else, but we have not costed and made any projections going forward of how much will all of this cost the state, given South Africa's unique spatial planning. Thanks, Chantal.
Emily and then Lanise, if I can ask you in that sequence to share your questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Chantal, and thanks, Mr. Mnele, for your presentation and also your leadership in this area. I'm Emily, I come from Meridian Economics. We're a think tank in the intersection of the finance, energy, and climate spaces. My question was really very specifically around the acceleration of decarbonisation in the power sector, realising that that's one component of the areas that the JETP is intended to address. And the question being that in that the main barriers to decarbonisation of power are more in the institutional and political domains than in the finance domain, understanding that renewable energy is increasingly the least cost form of power generation. But we've really battled as a country to get renewables onto the grid. And I'm just interested in how you see the link between the financial support that the JETP offers and these barriers and how it may be linked to overcoming these. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lamise Umarji. I'm a reporter at Fin24. I was quite interested in the comments made about the financial package and investment plan, really keeping the just transition part as central. And I just wanted to find out if there are more concrete examples of what these financial solutions are, because I know that this is just the beginning, but long term, what are we thinking of in terms of financing the transition? Like I know there's been some mention of just transition bonds, in other research, but I'm not sure if that is even being considered now. Yeah, maybe just some input on what you guys are really looking at.
Thank you very much for that set of questions. The first one from Andisa was around interest rates and how much is this going to cost, which flowed from the earlier question around terms and conditions and more broadly. Well, look, as I mentioned in my speech, is that what is clear is that we need to attract funding at rates that are more advantageous than what we could achieve in the marketplace. But I couldn't give you information at this stage because that is somewhat further down the line in terms of what we need to talk about sort of exact levels of rates. But it will be just going into the third question as well. It'll be a blend of various instruments and risk mitigation tools that we use so that overall, in terms of what people refer to as blended finance, we come up and put in front of cabinet something that would be defensible from a point of view of meeting the various sort of aspirations that we have as a country. So the long and short of it is I can't give you an interest rate if that is what you are looking for, but we will be watching and making sure that our unique fiscal and budgetary circumstances are taken into account in terms of what any funding is taken on at. I guess the issue that was raised, which is a more broader issue around urban planning, all I could say there is that the approach is one that needs to be holistic, it needs to be integrated, and as I said earlier, you can't look at this only from a climate finance lens only, but you need to make sure that what gets executed in terms of these partnerships and in terms of this initial amount of $8.5 billion happens within the contents of broad systemic kind of issues that we need to consider. The processes that will aid that and that are currently underway will include, for instance, this PCC conference that I referred to, which took place on Thursday and Friday last week, which was, of course, on the back of a round of consultations that they've undertaken right across the country with various constituencies and communities to exactly understand where the impact is going to be, and that those voices and whatever concerns come out of there are being heard as part of any decisions and any plans going forward. And I guess the questions that you're asking, one element of addressing those and getting to the bottom of those was in terms of this holistic and system-wide thinking, was the Just Transition Framework, for instance, that they put out and which had been commented on and is being refined and is taken into cabinet. But so issues that are sort of economy-wide considerations will need to flow into processes such as those and the consultation process that are taking place through other structures. But I can't agree more. We need to make sure that this is holistic and it's inclusive and provides integrated responses to all our challenges. Emily, the issue about sort of the decarbonization of the power sector and issues there being potentially more political than purely related to finance. I guess there's a point there, and that's something that need careful attention to be paid to, because, as I indicated earlier, there are policy challenges, there is need for policy alignment, there's need for a unified vision as South Africa in terms of how we define our priorities as such. And based on certainly what we are observing at the moment, in some instance, you may well be right that finance might end up not being the problem, but execution, alignment of policies and more operational issues. And so that's something in terms of creating capacity to be able to tackle those things needs to happen alongside raising finance. But policy alignment and sequencing and prioritization of projects and making sure that the financing that can deployed in a manner that then leverages other processes would be important. I think I'd covered those last three, Chantal.
Okay.
And I guess with regard to LAMES, some of those issues, of course, it's just too early to tell around the kind of more detailed financial aspects that you'd be looking at. I think you touched also on innovation towards the end. So yeah, various financial instruments. As I said in my talk, we need to be innovative. We need to think a little bit outside the box, and in terms of this not being business as usual, as I said, and requiring us to look at new ways of understanding the problem and finding appropriate solutions.
Thanks for your patience, Daniel. We have 3 more sets of 3 lined up for you. So you did ask for questions, and they're on, they're definitely on its way. So I'm going to invite Mike Muller, then David Hallows, and then Moshlo Koa as well to give to ask their questions, and then we have another set after them. Thanks, Daniel.
Thanks, Chantal, and thanks very much for this presentation. It's really very comprehensive and helpful. We're talking about conditionalities as though they are something that we can deal with, but I wonder whether we can consider some retrospective action on the costs that have been imposed by the World Bank and because of their internal political economy. 40 billion that we're being asked to pay to reduce flue gas emissions at Medupi. And unfortunately, those flue gas reductions, the IPCC AR6, which has just been published, tells us that those are aggravating global warming, but for environmental politics reasons at the bank, we've been asked to clean those up. What we're doing is we're diverting funding from decarbonization, as Andre de Ruyter has noted, and it just shows how easy it is for conditionalities to be imposed because of external political economies. And I wonder if you've given any thought as to how we can help our partners to deal with some of the pressures that they have from their own interest groups who have very, very direct agendas to promote. So just that question. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you.
David and Moshlo, you can just jump in straight after each other.
Great, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, I can.
Great. Just a question on the transparency of the process going forward. How much during the negotiating process can we expect to kind of see what's on the table? In terms of stuff like how much is going to be grant funding, how much is going to be loan funding, how much is going to go to an energy transition narrowly conceived, how much to the justice bit of it. So that's really my central question. Just on the matter of air quality, I think it's just worth remembering that Eskom's power stations are responsible for about 2,000 deaths a year. So I think it's quite a big deal whether or not we actually have pollution abatement equipment. Thank you.
Thanks, David. This is Motlhoko Ngwashane from the NBI. And just following on David's point, at COP26, there was a huge buzz at the announcement of the 8.6 billion and the partnership. And as you mentioned, it's garnered a lot of interest and attention of other governments as well as institutions. With COP27 being held in Egypt, so it being an Africa COP, I think much of the world will be looking towards an update as to where the progress of the JET partnership is. And in your presentation, you alluded to presenting a short-term plan before COP27. So just looking to maybe find some more information on what that short-term plan may look like and what details you may be able to give at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mike, of course, you raise a very important and sensitive issue around conditionalities And I mean, all I can say in that respect is, certainly as the negotiating team, we will be very attuned to ensuring that the program overall, as I indicated before, is fit for purpose, that there's a need to understand what our ambitions and what our priorities are, and for solutions to speak to those and to address those. And certainly if there are sort of risk perspective type issues, things that might have been imposed at some point, but don't quite serve our needs now, or even jeopardize what we're trying to do now. And what one would potentially have to talk about those type of issues. But the key overriding message there would be that the solutions must support South Africa's ambitions and priorities more broadly, whether it straddles the issues of financing cost, whether it's conditionality, whether it's investment plans in terms of uses of funds, on all of those type of things. That's where exactly the point that I was making earlier in responding to Joel around the need for this program to exhibit leadership from the country, to exhibit ownership of what we agree there, and quite importantly, as I've just been saying, to take into account our country-specific circumstances. As far as the transparency of the process is concerned, yes, we are committed to an inclusive and transparent process. But I would need to quite frankly state that I don't want to mismanage expectations, in that what certainly probably would not be appropriate is to give a running commentary on negotiations, given that we don't negotiate in public or in the media as such, but there is a commitment periodically to give updates as to where the process is and where it is going. So that's all I can say about that. We will regularly provide updates, but that, as I said, will not amount to a running commentary on those negotiations, which for obvious reasons would be counterproductive. Around COP27, yes, indeed, an African COP. We are, as I said earlier, working towards ensuring that by the time of COP, we can report significant progress with regard to the partnership, and hopefully be in a position to have initiated some of those projects. But there is quite a lot of work to be done. There are complex issues at play here. What we need to do is to ensure that there is a two-pronged type approach, in the sense that the underlying issues around climate change, climate risks that we're dealing with are obviously quite precarious, quite urgent, and that needs urgency in all our dealings. But at the same time, for some of the reasons that I stated earlier around how integrated, how holistic, and how defining all of this is going to be for our broad economic transformation and our growth and development model going forward, one must also be careful to avoid undue haste, given that these are very, very complex and long-term effects that would come from decisions and choices that we make. So, yeah, our ambition is to show a progress, but in line with what I've said, of an investment plan that's got these short-term components to it, but also the longer-term trajectories that will make an impact in terms of the just transition.
Thank you, Daniel. Next round would be from Gopani and then Ashraf, and then I'll read out Jacqueline from Bloomberg Philanthropy's question because she's challenged on the mic side. So Gopani first, and then Ashraf can share your intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, Program Director. So my question is actually triggered by a comment Mr. Minele made in the presentation around the looming carbon border tax that we can expect going forward from our main trading partners. So my question is actually touching on other key exporting sectors of the South African economy. So one appreciates that this funding seems to focus on the energy production and generation to lower our carbon emissions. But when you look at some key sectors that are exporting, what you find is that they are also key contributors to carbon emissions, but also other emissions such as sulfur dioxide, methane, and others. So what is the expectation then around that with this funding going forward, Mr. Minele, would there be scope for assisting such sectors, or would they be expected to make investments to decarbonize at own cost as such? So I just wanted to know how the funding will evolve going forward and how it can touch on other sectors. Thank you very much, Chantal.
Is Ashraf still on the call?
Yes, he is. Hi.
Okay, great, Ashraf. Thank you.
Hi, good day, everybody. Yeah, well, excuse my cynicism. I've been around this block so many times and participated in all the enthusiasms of all the new ideas that we come across. But if you look at the municipal sphere and infrastructure spend in the municipal sphere, that is where the most innovation and the most just infrastructure can be provided and is being provided. But it is not in terms of the objectives of the just transition. So my question to you is what's going to be done differently? Because my understanding is that the problem really is with the engineering consulting industry that's not specifying the kind of infrastructure that we require, that's already been known to be valuable to climate infrastructure. So yeah, just bottom line, what's going to be done differently this time that hasn't been tried before? And ideas that just haven't seen the light of day because there was just no effort into them. Thank you.
Daniel, I'm just going to read Jacqueline Sitwa's from Bloomberg Philanthropy's questions. She had two. How are you engaging the broader mining sector in the just transition conversations, and specifically the coal sector, as part of funding the just transition and incorporating these principles into their mine closing plans? That's the one. The second is, what specific role can philanthropy play in supporting your goals outside the $8.5 billion? Thanks.
Sorry, Chantal, just repeat the last bit.
Sure. It was, what specific role can philanthropy play in supporting your goals outside the $8.5 billion?
Thank you.
Okay.
Right. I mean, the first one was around the cross-border carbon taxes. I mean, the issue that I was sort of trying to put across in my remarks was that we need to sort of act in such a manner that, you know, what is within our own control, we should address, and to avoid being on the receiving end of either climate actions or specific economic measures being imposed by our partners in the north or trading partners elsewhere. And of course, this whole process, as I indicated, is the start. This is an initial amount, and the idea is here not to say that that needs to fill all cracks. It cannot. As I indicated earlier, the actual amounts that are needed for an holistic and integrated transition far exceed the 8.5 and will require programs that obviously go beyond this. And even within the IPG and the South African political declaration, there is a view for this to be a longer partnership. It's just that the 8.5 billion that was committed to be mobilized was pegged over this period of 3 to 5 years. So, like I said, it's a decades, 30-year journey that we're embarking on. This is just the start of it, and a lot more needs to happen. And I think the thinking was with regard to our revised NDC, this nationally determined contribution that was supplied, in terms of looking at where the maximum impact could be in terms of kind of where you start, if you wish. The energy and transport sectors were identified as those that hold the highest potential, but also when you look at green hydrogen, look at electric vehicles, that also has a component of starting to support new industries of the future. So yeah, you talked about sort of public-private type issues, that those need to be part and parcel of that. And so the key issue around the threats that we're facing in not transitioning with the right sense of urgency are those economic measures, and of course, quite frankly, the climate-related risks that we are already exposed to. Look, the second question, in a way, given, I guess, the experience, one might understand an element of cynicism or despondency around what is going to be different as such. But I think certainly I am not in the camp of those who have lost hope. I think if we pull together, if we think innovatively, some of the issues that I mentioned in my talk, and that requires a business not as usual, whether it's from the way in which we refine our policies, and the way in which we think about risk allocation, about responsibilities, about who equitably and fairly participates in the risk allocation and the distribution of opportunities that come from this, is what hopefully will make things different. And quite frankly, what I think will end up being very different from what we've seen before is when we start to fully appreciate and understand the risks that we're up against. I mean, the level of friction is at a level already where change is inevitable, and the cost of inaction, of not doing anything because we think it's been tried before and nothing actually ever came of it, will register in the form of almost daily and occurrences of these consequences of not managing these risks. And I sort of alluded to what we've seen as changing weather patterns, rainfalls, regularity of cyclones, and those kind of issues and disruptions. This is reality. This is not music of the future. These are not risks that we can afford to manage at some time in the future. They are with us today and need to be tackled with urgency. So I think that alone ought to inform a different approach to maybe the approaches that may have been deployed previously. And the last question around the mining sector, obviously very, very important, a sector that forms part of the consultations that are being undertaken, and mining companies, as you know, when we talk about communities, about employees that have been affected, they have tended to be just apart from, from providing certain jobs and guaranteeing livelihoods, they are part of a whole ecosystem around some of those communities where mining companies operate. So they have to be part and parcel of the planning with regards to how we decarbonize and what role they play. And I alluded to an example of this, a proof of concept that I saw on Friday, which shows, for instance, how a mining company can be very forward-looking and forward-thinking. With regard to philanthropy, again, the 8.5 is far below what the requirements are for public and private investments that are needed for us to transition. But I think philanthropies tend to be positioned and better placed to play, particularly with regards to the just component of the transition and facilitating flow of funds that typically wouldn't flow that easily with regard to communities and employees. There's a role there, I think, philanthropies could help. And in particular, also back to the question that I think Sheila was asking earlier, some of the education projects, the conscientization projects that needs to be invested to make sure that we all understand the urgency of what needs to happen. But there is ample use for philanthropy money given what the demands are.
Thank you, Daniel. If I may, and you don't mind, to use the chair's prerogative to ask you a few questions that I would be very keen to hear your views on, and the one being that it's very hard to ignore the broader geopolitical environment, especially that our global north and a large part of the IPG partners are experiencing. Sort of the longer term economic impacts and social impacts around COVID-19 in their countries, as well as the Russia-Ukraine war. And just your thoughts on how you see those dynamics potentially influencing South Africa and other developing countries' access to international finance generally, both development and climate, and obviously, JETP specific. That is the one. The second would be, when we were putting together the book, there was very much a narrative that all we're dealing with is, from a developing country perspective, is the creation of climate debt traps. So while there is an obligation to support developing country, most of what's on offer is debt, even to least developed countries. And if you could share some of your perspectives of how, given that is the kind of historic position, what are your thoughts on how this might be different, the JP being different? And perhaps the last question I would have is that we have thrown a barrage of questions at you, as you well spotted and anticipated. Do you have, in your closing, any questions that you would like to throw out to the audience, and also just to take up, just to give some more granularity to your invitation? Are there any top of mind questions that others could help you answer to help in the work that you've been undertaking? Thanks, Daniel.
Thanks, Chantal. Interesting questions. I think with the first one, a way needs to be found, and it also links to what I've just been saying now around really what we're up against, what the risks are, what the consequences are, and how quickly they will register. Puts us in a situation where we can't talk about trade-offs. I don't think from a point of what is unfolding geopolitically, the responses that we have had with regards to COVID and how much money actually that has cost, particularly in developing countries, to mount a response, some of which found themselves already in fairly precarious fiscal situations by the time the crisis struck. All of this needs to fit into whatever we are trying to do. So we can't trade off the climate change issues with regard to what need to be diverted to potentially support initiatives around the conflict resolution in the Ukraine, or continuing to fight the pandemic. These things have to be pursued all in parallel, and it's going to be tough. I mean, that's why the discussions then have to very much focus on where the greatest impact is going to be when resources become scarce, that the sequencing, the prioritization is then given a proper attention. But, I'm not quite sure, it's a difficult question how to respond to it, but my sense is that, we can ill afford to think that there could be trade-offs, that this could be more important than the other. Debt traps, dangerous, whether they're climate related or arise from other situations. They need to be avoided because you end up in a very inefficient use of money and diverting critical resources to debt service and interest payments and those kind of things, which could be more productively used in the real economy and in communities. Critical to this process, as I have said, is at every juncture to make sure that affordability criteria, sustainability of fiscal situations are paid attention to very closely, and that whatever solutions we come up with must be cost effective from a South African perspective. And that's why we are pushing very strongly for strong concessionality and for the grant components where possible to form a larger part of the package. And as I said earlier, also from a point of view of when we're looking at private contributions and all that, just think about what risk allocations, what return expectations, what investment horizons this new paradigm that we are in demands of us. But it's certainly, the risk is there, especially given that, as I said, debt, we already, particularly in Africa, even before COVID, there was already a debt crisis looming in many countries. So we can't allow this to worsen. So in that regard, issues of fiscal affordability and sustainability must be front and center in everything that gets negotiated. My own questions, not really questions as such, but maybe just to reiterate what I said earlier, that this is all our transition and it's not a government a project only, it's not a public sector a project only. I think it is important, especially given that the focus today is on financing and mobilizing resources. It is important that those pools, significant pools of private capital that can be mobilized to support this transaction are mobilized. And for that, we need to know what various people see, what are interventions from the public sector that people believe need to be embarked upon to facilitate an easier flow of private climate finance flows, and what do people see as binding constraints to becoming involved in a much more active and quicker way in these projects. So it's, again, just appealing to people, become part of the process, join in the broader movement of trying to find responsible solutions that understand that we are all in it together.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That was awesome. Thank you for the great interventions and your patience as we shared these questions with you. And if I can also just thank the audience for their great participation and the great questions from everyone. There have been a few more that have come in since, but I think we are on time. So I have to hand over to Nobile very shortly. But just to, again, just express all of our gratitude to everybody on the call for engaging. If I may hand over to Nobile, and you can take us toward the end of the session. Thank you.
Chantal, may I, just before Nobile closes, also just express my gratitude for the opportunity and for this very rich interaction, and also indicate that maybe Mistra can collect the questions that we weren't able to get to and transmit them to us, and we'll seek to maybe respond as best as we can, again, through Mistra.
I can quickly give you a thematic on them. The one was around the climate change bill, and how does the Just Transition Partnership connect with the comments around the Just Transition bill. And then there was one about from Safika on the future generations and benefit for them. So how can young people contribute to making the process of the Just Transition seamless outside of these engagements? And then Sheila also encouraged us to please consider broader issues of food security and sovereignty. Not only that, but broaden the scope of the kind of justice dimensions that might be considered.
Okay, we will deal with them. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Daniel Minele, as well as Chantal, for that interesting discussion. I would first like to just thank Mr. Daniel Minele and his team for availing themselves and engaging with us in this very important issue for South Africa. He has indeed clarified South Africa's approach and position to financing this transition and unlocking the financing mechanisms that South Africa can access for its just energy transition. In his address, Mr. Minele has emphasized the importance of the consultations with various stakeholders to ensure that this is an inclusive process and works for all South Africans. And he further invited everyone to engage his office on this matter. We hope that this platform has provided a foundation for future interactions of this nature, where we can all shape the future of the just energy transition in South Africa. I would also just like to thank Salim and his team, as well as the Mistra team, for ensuring the success of this discussion forum. And I would also like to thank all our stakeholders for accepting this invitation and attending this discussion and, engaging throughout. Indeed, the questions and discussion will assist in shaping the discourse of the energy transition partnership. Please contact Mistra if you have any further questions, comments, and you would like any further information about our research work as well as our publications. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.